First Church. We couldn't be more thrilled to be hosting this talk by Robert Corcoran, and I am delighted to introduce him. Many of you know Robbie as a church member, a part of the Special Grants Committee, and as the newly appointed co-historian of First Church. You may not know, however, that in his day job, Robbie is the Senior Vice President, now wait for it, of Mass Affluent Segment and Merrill Edge Marketing at the Bank of America. I have no idea what that means. So we'll have to take that up with Robbie later.
Does Robbie know what it means?
Another thing you might not know is that this is not Robbie's first book. He has previously published a history of the Wenham House he shares with his husband Rick, entitled History of the Thomas Killam House. A fascinating history, not just of the house, but of the surrounding area of West Wenham as well. Through this work, Robbie became aware of the presence of enslaved people in Wenham. I looked back through my email, and it was exactly 1 year ago that Robbie sent a message setting his intention to write this book. Remarkably, 12 months later, the finished book was delivered to my door. Right? Robbie's work is not an internet search. It is not secondary reporting. It is meticulously researched history, gleaned from primary sources, the historical records from First Church, the Southern Essex Registry of Deeds in Salem, the archives of the Wenham Museum, and the attics and basements of historic houses in town, as well as the woods and trails of Wenham. By the way, don't forget this for later, Robbie is a master of citations. His footnotes are a wonder to behold. If you think I'm kidding, I'm not kidding. They're not to be missed or glossed over when you read the book. What Robbie has achieved through this work is illuminating an aspect of our history that has until now gone largely unrecognized. Enslavement of African people, men, women, and children happened here. It happened here to such an extent that, as Robbie has noted, 1 in 17 people in Wenham were enslaved in the mid-18th century, representing 5.8% of the population. In the 2020 census, the percent Black and African American in Wenham was 1.7%. These statistics, are not unrelated, but we'll leave that discussion for another evening. Tonight is for illumination and introductions. Tonight we meet Pompey and Caesar and Flora and Hazard and many others of the enslaved population of Wenham who lived, loved, and labored here in this beautiful town, all while living lives of bondage. In the book, we also encounter some familiar names, those of the enslavers, who have had a presence in our history in many cases, minus, of course, the enslavement aspect. We all know and recognize the power of eye contact. We have all had the experience of being in conversation when someone will not or cannot look you in the eye. It is a deflating experience, and it elicits feelings of isolation and sadness. Imagine, if you will, not having had eye contact for centuries. Imagine not being recognized as a human being with the right to self-determination, and then being erased from history. I ask you to bear that in mind as we go forward. I ask you to hold the gaze of these enslaved people, to not look away even when it becomes uncomfortable, and to finally, after hundreds of years, meet their gaze with dignity, respect, humility, and humanity, as we finally and at long last welcome them home.
Thank you, Deidre. That was wonderful. Let me just get pointed here. Oops. Is there a reason this is not? Oh, stage manager. Better. Okay. Thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to see you all here. Thank you. one piece of logistics, men's room and ladies' room are down the hallway. Don't be shy. I grew up in the Connecticut River Valley, partway between historic Deerfield and Sturbridge Village. And I do not remember a time when my parents weren't taking my brothers and me to historic house museums. And I just fell in love with colonial history at a very early age. And I developed this image of life in rural New England in the 1700s. These houses with central chimneys and saltbox roofs, and farmers who look like Minutemen with their tricorn hats, and their wives either working in the fields with them or at enormous fireplaces. And I had this image in my head for decades. And I had this image in my head when my husband and I moved to Wenham. This was my image of what Wenham was like in the 1700s. And there's a problem. There are no people of color in this image. Last year's book, there was another book, was Indigenous People in Wenham. This year's book is Enslaved People in Wenham. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself, and then, what is our agenda today? Okay, a little bit about ourselves. I do have some ground rules for tonight. Then I'll get into some aspects about the enslavers and the enslaved people, really trying to focus more of the content around the enslaved people than the enslavers this evening. Then I'll introduce you to two people who I am just fascinated by. I think I can do that in 45 minutes, and then I'll open things up for question and answer. As we get started, you should know a few things about me, because each of these things has had a role in how I've approached the content. One of my ancestors was an enslaver. He lived in Newport, Rhode Island in the 1600s. He had an enslaved man in his household named Mingo who ran away. We don't know what happened to Mingo after that. My husband and I lived in an enslaver's house. The point is, I've been through that emotional journey of, oh my word, I have an enslaver as an ancestor. And I've been through that emotional journey of, oh my gosh, there's an enslaver who lived in our house. And I'll come back to that in a couple moments. And as Deidre mentioned, I'm one of the historians here at this church. One word about that. As we were talking a few weeks ago about where to have this presentation, the idea was floated for having this presentation either at the Wenham Museum, which would have been a great venue, or at the Community House, also a great venue. But this is the place to have this presentation, because as I hope you'll see as this unfolds, you cannot talk about enslavement in Wenham, or most other towns too, without talking about the church. After this evening, yes, you can learn more about this. There's a handy dandy wallet card on most of your seats. Let you know where you can buy the book if you choose to, or where you can read it online for free if you choose to do that. Yes, I also want to mention that some financial support for this publication of this book came from the Hamilton Wenham Cultural Council. I'm very grateful for that. The financial support was very welcome, but buy the book. And yes, in addition to learning more about the topic, you can help us celebrate this population. We're, I don't know what the right word is, but we're really excited about having a regular church service this Sunday where we take the time to honor and celebrate these former residents of our town. If you can join us, please do. We do not care if you've ever been in this building or not. Everyone is welcome. Okay, we have some ground rules. Tonight is about history. We're not going to get into social change, reparations, all that sort of stuff. That will come later I imagine, but I'm not the one to lead that conversation, and we don't have the time for that either. No public questions about genealogy. If you have questions about genealogy, bring them to me in private or email me. You just don't know who's related to whom. And it could be the case that someone over here in this part of the room says, oh, tell me about my great-great-grandfather Ezekiel. And someone else in that part of the room could also be related to Ezekiel and not ready to hear the answer. So if you have questions about the enslavers, bring them to me in private. Or email me. Email address is on that wallet card. Okay, this is a tough topic, and I've been heads down in it for a year. And my best advice to you on whatever emotions you may have as you come to this topic, try to create a little bit of space of curiosity. Curiosity will help you through this topic. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, is the language is changing. We no longer say slave, we say enslaved person. We no longer say slave master or slave owner, we say enslaver. And the idea is to put some distance between someone's circumstances and their identity. Now, the language on this topic continues to change. There are parts of the new language that I have not accepted yet. We don't have to get into that. But what I do want to say is when we open things up for question and answer, if you use the old vocabulary, I promise not to chastise you. Okay, let's get started. Hopefully, most of you recognize this. This is the monument to Reverend Hugh Peter on Main Street at Wenham Lake. And here's Hugh. I'm going to tell you the story about Hugh Peter that is not written on his monument. And this story is a little difficult to follow because you have to keep track of events that happened in Wenham versus events that happened in Salem versus events that happened elsewhere. And most of it happens during a 3-year period in the 1630s. In 1637, the colonists went to war with the Pequot people in Connecticut. There was a group of about a dozen or so soldiers from Salem who joined the fight, even though the fighting was in faraway Connecticut, even though Connecticut was a different colony from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the English colonists captured a bunch of Pequot men, women, and children. The men were put on a boat headed to Bermuda to work the English plantations there. The women and children were distributed among colonists in Connecticut and Massachusetts as enslaved labor. Now, our friend Hugh heard about this distribution of captives, and he wrote a letter to the governor, John Winthrop, and said, hey, I'd like to have a couple. He got one. Her name was, she was assigned the name Hope, and she was brought back from Connecticut to Salem, worked in his, Hugh Peter lived in Salem. He lived and worked in his house. Things did not go well for her. After a couple of years, she tried to escape, but was caught and whipped for it. Her trail, I don't know what happened to her after that. But meanwhile, back to the captives. So the men were put on this boat to Bermuda, but the ship's captain decided, no, I'm not going to stop at Bermuda. I'm going to keep going to the West Indies. So we don't really know why he made that decision, but he did. Once he was there, he sold the Pequot men to slave traders, Spanish slave traders who were operating in the West Indies. And while he was there, he bought some men who had been kidnapped in Africa, or maybe might have been one generation removed from Africa. And he brought those men back to Salem and sold them in Salem in 1638. That's how the slave trade started in Essex County. Salem was slave ships were sailing in and out of Salem for the rest of the 1600s and for most of the 1700s, even after slavery was, technically speaking, outlawed. I'll get into that later on. So the ship captain brought these men back to Salem, sold them in Salem in 1638. That was right around the same time that our friend Reverend Hugh was preaching the first sermon ever preached in what would become Wenham, at that spot near Wenham Lake. The first incidents, or first recorded incidents of an enslaved person in Wenham was in 1703. We find records of 2 enslaved people, an unnamed enslaved boy and an enslaved man named Mingo. Mingo might have been a short form of the name Domingo. And if so, it probably hints at a Caribbean origin for him. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Wenham Church records. The records for this church have been incredibly important to this project. And what I'm showing here is a graph of the incidence of mentions of enslaved people in baptismal records, joining the church, marriages, deaths, and so on. So years down along the bottom. So not a whole lot of activity at the beginning of the 1700s. Then suddenly this big spike in 1738. That coincides with something called the Great Awakening. Great Awakening was a wave of religious revivalism that swept across the colonies in England too. And suddenly, everybody got religion. And so suddenly you see this huge influx of activity from enslaved people in our church records. And I think 2 things were happening at once. I think it is possible that some of these enslaved people had an organic interest in this church and were really moved by the religious climate of the times. In addition to that, however, I suspect some volume of this was enslavers saying, I want everybody in my household to come to church on Sundays. Here's a couple examples of what these records look like. On the top, Nancy, daughter of Scipio and Sarah, Negro servants. Nancy and her parents and her siblings lived 150 yards that way. Lazarus, an Indian servant. Lazarus lived next door in the Hobbs house. Just as an aside, one of the other historians of the church, Phil Stevens, has accurately pointed out that fewer and fewer people can read cursive writing. So he's embarking on this really cool project of transcribing the church record, so it's easier for more people to work with him in the future. But enslaved people went to church. The Puritans felt that enslavers had a responsibility to convert enslaved members of their households to Christianity. And Cotton Mather came up with a catechism and published this in 1707 that was designed to help enslavers teach the principles of Christianity to the enslaved members of their households. So we have here, The Negro Christianized, an essay to excite and assist the good work, the instruction of Negro servants in Christianity. So the enslavers were encouraged to bring the enslaved members of their households to church. And some part of this population probably had an organic interest in it. And let's remember, and shout out to my friend Jean, who pointed this out to me. If you're in church, you're not working. So, how many people? There is this problem of double counting. In almost all cases, enslaved people do not use a surname. Occasionally, you find a surname, but that's very, very rare. So, there are plenty of cases where there are multiple people here in Wenham with the same first name. And sometimes you can tell, oh, no, these are really different people. But other times, you can't tell whether it was really the same person who has moved from one enslaver to another. So we have the problem of double counting. We also have the problem of missing records. We know that we're missing records on some amount of enslaved people. We just don't know how many. Given these issues, though, I've been able to document between 109 and 124 enslaved people, and the range is because of this double counting issue. As I already mentioned, in mid-1700s, 1 in 17 residents of this town was enslaved, and more than half of them were baptized by or worshipped at this church. Speaking of this church, this was a really cool find. Okay, what we're looking at, this is a floor plan of the church building that was in service before this church building. This is the building where most of the activity happened. This is over at the Wenham Museum. It's been there for God knows how long, but no one has published it before, until now. So what we're looking at is west door, south door, east door. We see an aisle up the center and an aisle around the edges. Desk is probably where the pulpit was and where the deacon or deacons would have sat. And around the edges, we're looking at box pews. And in the center, we're looking at box pews. For those of you who don't know what a box pew is, this is a church somewhere in Maine, as I recall. And these boxes were basically pens where a family would sit together. Some people got to face the minister, other people didn't. But this is a really exciting thing to find. And the minister who was running the church at the time was a man named Reverend John Warren. He had 2 enslaved people in his household. So stick a pin in that. Everybody in town, black, white, purple, or orange, men, women, and children, were getting their religious leadership from an enslaver. And that was common. I mean, it didn't happen in every single town, but that was common. And that's a part of the bigger story that sometimes gets overlooked when people are talking about enslavement, that the religious leaders of the day were leading by example. So, what about some of the enslavers? Generally speaking, they were wealthy landowners, and they were wealthy because of their land. Now, John Warren was an exception. He was not a wealthy man, but is certainly a socially prominent man. And there were a couple of widows who were enslavers who didn't have adult sons to work their farms. And there's one other guy, I'll get to him in a minute, who was the exception to the rule. But generally speaking, we're talking about wealthy men, wealthy because of the amount of land that they owned. And generally speaking, enslavers here had 1 or 2 or 3 enslaved people. Not a dozen, not dozens, as we picture with plantation life in the South. And a key reason for that is because there's no 4-season crop growing here. And to put it very crudely, if you have to house people and feed people and you can't get revenue out of them, that's expensive. Now bear with me on this one. This is for the data geeks out there. This is the per capita valuation of enslaved people as a percentage of total assessed assets. Okay, that's a mouthful. I'm going to break it down for you. Yes, church records have been extremely important to this project. So also are probate records. Because when the enslaver dies, someone would do an inventory of their assets, so the heirs could figure out who gets what. Enslaved people were assets, and they were assigned monetary values. And what I'm doing here is taking a look at the monetary values assigned to enslaved people and comparing them to the overall assets of the enslaver at the time. And what it's saying is, in over half the cases for which we have data, an enslaved person was valued at 1% or less of an enslaver's assets. So 1% or less of assets. Now, for the data hounds in the room, there's a lot of noise in the data. It's only 27 probate records. That's a small sample size. This is assets, it's not net worth. Male enslaved labor was valued at more than women. A man who was in his 20s or 30s was valued more than someone who was older, and was valued more than someone who was younger. They don't adjust for that. But the point is, enslaved person, 1% of enslaver's assets. Except for this guy over here. He's the exception that proves the rule. This is the guy whose house was over right near the main entrance to Gordon College. And he was not a wealthy man. And he didn't have any adult sons. And he apparently made the decision to get an enslaved person to help compensate for the absence of having his own free labor from his own family. Now, let's talk a little bit about aspects of enslaved life here in Wenham. There were enslaved people who lived here who were born in Africa. There were enslaved people who lived here who were born on this side of the Atlantic. There are enslaved people who lived here who were born here. Indigenous, I showed the baptismal record or the death record for Lazarus. The 99% of the cases, enslaved labor in Wenham was of African descent. The indigenous was very rare. We also have cases where an enslaved person had one parent of African ancestry and another of European ancestry. That almost always meant that the mother was of African ancestry and the father was of European ancestry. That's as far as I'm going on that one. Good news. They married. This really was good news because it's been a year of slavery. So like, he got married. There are plenty of marriages of enslaved people here in town and children. Sometimes the married couple was part of the same household and stayed that way. Other times they were part of different households or started in the same household and were split up. And when they were split up, sometimes it was one partner went to another town. When that happened, the children redeemed the property of the mother's enslaver. There's one case of an enslaved man marrying a free woman of color. And then there's frequent use of Roman names. Pompey, Caesar, Scipio, Venus. It just reflects this cultural fascination in Western Europe and the Western European colonies during the 18th century. This cultural fascination with ancient Rome. And so you come to these names time and time again with enslaved people here and in other towns too. These are names that were never used in Wenham for people of European descent. Now, this stuff is so cool, but we don't know anything about it. So we have two snippets that hint at the transfer of culture from West Africa. The first is this annual festival in Lynn, and we only know about it thanks to it showing the cover page of it, A History of Lynn, written in 1829. And in this book, he talks about a man whose name was Pompey. There are half a dozen Pompeys in this presentation. That Pompey had been a prince of a people in West Africa, was abducted, brought to this country, lived as enslaved labor in Lynn for a couple of decades. He was actually emancipated at one point. And the point of the story is that each summer he would host a festival at his house, or really his cabin. And in those cases where the enslavers allowed it, enslaved people from all over Essex County came to this event. And according to the historian, enslaved people from Boston too. I'll take that on face value. But the point is, it's a big barbecue that you can imagine from plantation life in the South. Who knew that happened in Massachusetts? And it's an event where, the annual event, where enslaved people from different towns could talk to each other. An event where enslaved people who were born here could talk to enslaved people who were born in Africa. And, oh, I wish I knew more about it, but that's all I know. But it's important that there was this mechanism for people to talk and to share their experience with each other. And that becomes increasingly relevant with this other snippet. Okay, this is a different Pompey. Pompey was born in Wenham, 1752. He was probably born in that very house. That house was roughly where the intersection is today of Monument Street and Main Street. Pompey was the sexton of this church. Pompey used to play the fiddle at the tavern that was over on Arbor Street. Pompey is, so this story comes third hand. Pompey is said to have said that after he died, a few months after he died, his bones were to be exhumed and reassembled in the attic room where he used to live, so that he could keep an eye on future generations of the family he had served. No, okay, that's creepy. And it's third hand. It is conceivable he was making a joke. It is conceivable he was misquoted. But about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, there were lots of anthropologists doing work in West Africa documenting various cultures that they found there. And it turns out that there were a number of cultures in West Africa that had a practice of burying their dead beneath or adjacent to their house so that they could keep an eye on future generations. And I think that's really cool. There's a second layer of coolness to it, because this guy was born in this country. So if he is talking about a West African burial practice, someone told him that. But that's all we know about it. Now, the other cool thing about this story is that it lets us know he lived in a room in the attic. This is a room in the attic. My husband's in my house. An enslaved man lived in our house in the 1730s. His name was Pompey. There's a different Pompey. This room, as currently configured, was built after our Pompey lived in our house. So it is not the case that an enslaved man is documented as living in this room. But I think this room gives a really good idea of what living accommodations looked like for most enslaved people in Wenham. This is the outside of the room. This is the inside of the room. The slanted part of the ceiling, you can see some wooden shingles tacked to the underside of the roof deck to stop water leaks. But what's very exciting about this is the plaster along the top of the ceiling and the walls. Now, the line in plaster burns wood. So when you pull plaster down, and you can tell when there's plaster there previously. There has never been any plaster anywhere else in our attic, only in this room. That's important because it tells us that this room was used not just for storage, but for habitation. Now, staying on the topic of the enslaved experience in Wenham, yes, some enslaved people tried to run away. This is an advertisement from 1775. A man named Scipio ran away from his enslaver. The enslaver lived in what is now Hamilton. The enslaved man ran away to join the fight in the Revolutionary War and fight the British. And his enslaver found him encamped with the colonial army on Prospect Hill in Somerville, brought him back, and traded him for another enslaved man with a Wenham enslaver. So this man wasn't living in Wenham at the time of this ad, but he would later live in Wenham. Ran away from me, the subscriber, on Sunday nights, the 25th of June, a Negro man named Scipio, about 30 years of age, about 6 feet high, well set, speaks good English. He doesn't speak English well, he speaks good English. He had 2 scars on his temple between his eyes and his ear. We don't know if that was because of punishment or an accident. We don't know how he got the scars. He carried away with him a large pack, 2 suits of clothes, 1 blue coat lined with red, 1 coat of a brown color, 1 calico lapel jacket, a black jacket, 1 pair of moose skin breeches. That sounds fun. A pair of black and white breeches, besides a great coat and other jackets, shirts and trousers, and a felt hat. It is suspected he had a pass, and I don't know what a pass would have looked like at this time. One day I'm going to track down one. Whoever will take up said Negro and convey him to his master or commit him to jail so that he may be returned to me shall have $4 reward and necessary charges paid by me. Okay, if you can look past the fact that this is an ad for a runaway enslaved man, there are 2 really cool things about the ad. First of all, the description of the clothing.
Yeah.
You can tell what they look like. The other really cool thing about the ad is the reward, $4. And it's a reminder that the word dollar was in circulation for other currencies before there was a United States. So, let me introduce you to this guy's my hero. I'm just such a fan of him, Samson Brown. He shows up around the time of the Revolution, so he was probably born in the 1750s. One of his parents was of European descent, the other parent was of African descent. His enslaver was a Tory, and so his enslaver was on the British side. And they lived over the Hobbs house. His neighbors, the enslaver's neighbors, hated him. He was maybe the only Tory in town, and he almost got tarred and feathered. For those of you who don't know what tar and feathering is all about, the victim gets dragged out into the public square, stripped to the waist, if not stripped naked, smeared with tar, then doused with feathers, some would pluck a chicken or a goose earlier that day, and then paraded around town. Didn't happen to the enslaver, but it almost did. He escaped at the last minute. Samson runs away from the enslaver to enlist in the army and fight the British in the Revolutionary War. In other words, he's trying to fight the guys like his enslaver. This has movie written all over it. Samson and his unit go to upstate New York, where the colonists were fighting the British for control of the Hudson River. They won, which is good news. But in the fighting, Samson was hit in the hip with a cannonball. This was 1777. Nobody gave him any morphine. I just can't imagine what it was like to have a shattered hip. But he survived. He survived that. Now, the colonists won that battle. I'm just curious if everyone knows the Revolutionary War history. After the colonists beat the British to get control of the Hudson River, does anyone know where the colonial army went for winter quarters?
Valley Forge.
Yeah, Valley Forge. Yeah. Our guy Samson was at Valley Forge with George Washington. And he survived the winter at Valley Forge. Now, where's that in the history books? And by the way, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is right around the corner. Where's the monument in town to Wenham's Revolutionary War soldiers? Maybe you should take it out of this project. Okay, so there we go. Come on. There we go. So he survived the winter at Valley Forge and spent the rest of the war in Boston guarding sensitive military sites. And after the war, he stayed in Boston. Samson wasn't the only one who stayed away from Wenham after the war. He wasn't the only one who left Wenham after the war. And in fact, after the war, something very important happened. And that is, there we go. There's an exodus of people of color. What I'm showing here is an estimate of the volume of people of color for 1770 through 1830. So directionally, these numbers are good. Big drop off from 1770, before the fighting. Big drop off to 1780, when the fighting in New England was pretty much over. Wenham got very white very quickly. And Wenham wasn't the only town. This was a common phenomenon. Thank you, Gene. It was a common phenomenon all over New England, all over the colonies, where suddenly, in the case of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 said, all right, no more slavery. So suddenly you had all these people with no job and no place to live. Some of them negotiated arrangements with their former enslavers and stayed with their former enslavers, but most of them had nowhere to go, nothing to do, and consequently migrated to the population centers, Salem, Boston, in search of work. Another thing was happening around the same time. It's something that we call unfreedom, where people were technically free, but weren't always treated that way. So, Massachusetts Constitution said no more slavery, 1780. I'm going to jump ahead. There followed a 50 or 60 year period where it took time for the courts to interpret the Massachusetts Constitution. It took time for these issues to bubble up through the courts. And there are various cases during this period where one aspect of the issue was heard and resolved. And it wasn't until 1836, this case called Commonwealth versus Aves, where the Supreme Judicial Court said, okay, if you're an enslaved person outside of Massachusetts and come into Massachusetts by virtue of crossing the state line, you are now free. So, but it took that much time to get the law to that point. But meanwhile, back to 1789, slave ships were still sailing in and out of Salem Harbor. 1789, there was this one particular case where a ship was on its way from Africa to Salem, and the captives took control of the ship. And they ended up killing the captain. They were subdued by the other members of the crew. The captain was a cousin of a very prominent family here in Wenham. So no doubt that was a topic of conversation at the time. So it's time to start wrapping up, but I want to introduce you to one more person, Phyllis Freeman. This is her signature, and I love this signature. She spells her name phonetically. Phyllis, P-H-E-L-I-S, Freeman, one E, you don't need two E's if you're spelling phonetically. Except it's not really phonetic because she spelled it with PH instead of F. No capital letters, there's just character all over the signature. I love this signature. She was 76 years old when she signed her name. She signed her name to a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. And this is one of those moments where you're in the library, it's like cheering. It's like, oh, she lived that long. She got to sign. She got to see this part of the story. There were quite a few abolitionists. That's what I'm looking for. Petitions circulating in the 1830s. There's one circulating in Wenham, 1838. It was started by the Baptist Church that's over in Wenham Neck. The building's still there. The first two people who signed the petition were the Baptist Church minister and his wife. Members of the Baptist Church and the Congregational Church also signed the petition. The minister of this church did not sign it. I don't know why. I don't pretend to know why. I don't know anything about his politics, so I don't know if he objected to it, or was he away that week when it was circulating around the town? I don't know. But his name is glaringly absent. But what's glaringly present is 36 signatures from children and grandchildren of Wenham's enslavers. So over this 50 or 60 year period following the revolution, the grandkids got it. So I'm going to end my story there. I do encourage you to take a look at the book, and I absolutely encourage you, please, if you can, join us for the service of remembrance. It's time to give these former members of our town the respect that they're due. And our service will be a first step in that direction. So I'm going to end my story there, and I know I've covered a lot in a short amount of time. Are there any questions? Yes?
You touched upon the notion that this one enslaved person, Pompey, that you mentioned, you believe may have been born in that house.
Yes.
That kind of raises that larger question. What do we know, if anything, about how enslaved people were quartered? In the Southern model, oftentimes it was outside the house in other ways.
Yeah.
You suggest that perhaps here, at least in one instance, it was different.
Yeah, the question is about living accommodations for enslaved people here. And the only fact that we have is the story about Pompey living in the ruined attic in that house. We don't have any evidence of what we might think of as slave quarters that we think of as southern plantations, or even, what's the name of the house in Medford?
Royal House.
Thank you. There's no evidence of anything like that here in Wenham. All we have is a snippet about Pompey living in a room in the attic.
Thank you.
Jean?
Well, when we talk about people living in one or two or three at most, it gives the impression of very isolated people. Could you talk a little bit about what you've discovered in the records about really a proto-community going on?
Thank you, Jane. And this really is, this whole idea of isolation is what got me started on this project. Because when I learned that Pompey, another Pompey, lived in our house, my immediate reaction was, how lonely was he? Was he the only one in West Wenham? Was he the only one in Wenham? So that's what got me started on the project. And it turns out that the abutting farm to the northwest had a couple of enslaved people. The abutting farm to the other direction had a couple of enslaved people as well. And more or less, you couldn't go more than 4 or 5 farms anywhere in town without encountering enslaved labor. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to hear about this annual event at Lynn, that there was some sort of mechanism for social activity. And, but past that, I'm guessing. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm curious if that the festival in Lynn is related to what's called the Negro Picnic in Salem Hollows.
Yeah, I don't know. Thank you. Question was about a similar event in Salem, and I don't know. I haven't gone there yet. Yes,
I
John.
have 3 quick ones, Robbie. The ship rebellion, was that homicide?
No.
Second, wasn't wait. The other question was, you said marriages. Were those church or documented marriages, or those jump the broom marriages? And I already got the third one. So.
Okay. We certainly have church records of marriages of enslaved people. And we also know that other couples of enslaved people married, for which we don't have a church record. So, but I'm not going to venture a guess on what that ceremony may or may not have looked like.
Well, and the third one was, are there any tombstones of any of these people, or mass burials, or?
I was so expecting that to be the first question. Okay, let's talk about burial places. What time is it? All right. There are 3 sites in town where I believe enslaved people have been buried. Altogether, they probably account for maybe 15 or so people, which means that there are dozens of people who are unaccounted for. Each of the sites has its own level of confidence associated with it. Okay, the highest level confidence site is off of Larch Road. If you go into the 4 corners, the intersection of Larch Road and Walnut Road, it's a beautiful white house on the corner on the hill behind that house. There's nothing there, guys. The homeowner and I traipsed around. There's nothing to be seen. But very high level of confidence that there is a burial ground there, because I found a newspaper article from 1889 where someone who grew up in that neighborhood talked about his childhood, 1830s, 1840s. And at the time, Phyllis Freeman, the woman whose signature I showed you, took him to this location, and they could see the raised outlines of graves, plural, the number of which was not identified. That's one site. There's a second site that I will describe as off Dodge's Row. I'm not going to describe in more detail where it is. It is believed that there are 7 people who have been buried there. No, there's nothing to be seen there either. And then the third site, so both of those, the first 2 sites are on private land, and that's important to keep in mind. The third site is on town-owned land. It's over at the Iron Rail property. It's right near the water tower. That one is medium level of confidence. The one record I could find of it was a letter written in the 1970s, not 1870s, 1970s, written by a guy who grew up in the area, who said, oh yeah, everyone knows that this particular place is called Pompey's Island, yet another Pompey. And Pompey was buried there. And the author of this letter describes what the site looks like. And he describes it from the vantage point of an island that's out in the middle of a swamp in the Iron Rail property. And if you go out to this island, be very careful. It's beautiful. It is beautiful out there, but you have to wade through a foot of swamp water, and so you take one step. It's like, oh, I hope the ground is right there. I assigned that site, but when you get out to the island and look around, it's like, oh, that's the site this guy's talking about. There's no question that there's another site that looks like what this guy describes. I assigned it a medium level of conviction because no one has ever pinpointed on a map before. So if that were the case, I would assign a high level of conviction. But I don't assign it a low level of conviction because there's no other site that looks like it. That looks like what's described in the letter. One day, it would be appropriate, I think, for some sort of historic marker that says something like, it is believed that an enslaved man was buried near here. Yes?
A few years ago, we had a local talk about the stone walls of New England, and that many of them were built by enslaved people. Can you talk at all about the nature of the work done by these folks?
I'm looking at my husband because I told him 2 weeks ago, Kirsten's going to ask about the stone walls. And not to pick on it, but it is not true that every stone wall in town was built by enslaved labor. And I've heard that time and time again over the last 25 years. It is not true. It is true that some sections of some stone walls were built by enslaved labor. It is also true that some sections of some stone walls were built by enslavers. And it is certainly true that there are plenty of stone walls who were built by people who were neither enslavers nor enslaved. That being said, there are some account books over at the museum that where enslavers document the work that their enslaved labor did. So you can see that, oh yeah, so-and-so spent a day building a wall. So it's very clear that some sections, some walls were built by enslaved labor, but there aren't enough clues to say, oh, I bet it's that wall, or I bet it's that one. Yes?
Were enslaved people allowed to be members of this church and hold committee roles?
The question was about membership in this church, and the answer is yes. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there were early 18th centuries, there are 3 levels of membership in what we think of today as a congregational church. There's baptism, owning the covenant, and full membership. Owning the covenant was allowed you to participate in church life, but it connoted the absence of a spiritual awakening, of a conversion. And in the absence of a conversion experience, you could not be a full member of the church. Enslaved people in Wenham enjoyed each of those 3 levels. So yes, there were full-fledged members of the church who were enslaved. Yeah. Yes.
Did the enslaved people and enslavers worship together, meaning did they sit together during church worship, or?
Thank you. I forgot to mention that. The question was about seating in the meeting house. No, seating was segregated. It doesn't show up on the floor plan that I showed you because that floor plan was drawn after enslavement was no longer a thing in Wenham. Seating was segregated. Yes?
So I'm thinking about
about the runaway notice,
Yes.
where the slave left carrying, what, 7 jackets, sealskin pants,
Yeah.
and it started me thinking about the quality of life, how well they were clothed, and I wondered in your research if you stumbled on anything that would give you clues about quality of life or longevity or anything.
The question was about quality of life for enslaved people in Wenham. And the short answer is, I think it's a reasonable assumption that Wenham had a little bit of everything. By which I mean, I think it's a reasonable assumption that that some enslaved people were, for lack of a better word, happier with their situation than other enslaved people in town. But I don't have any specifics on that. Yes?
There are a lot of times in records where you see reference to, of course, the abundance of court cases and things that were going on at the time that might give clues to what people required to do to keep up their estate, their family, perhaps their enslaved labor as well. Is there anything you've come across that speaks to the ways in which the court life might have reflected upon the nature of these individuals?
Question about court records and that reflect on enslaved people in Wenham. Excuse me. Only one thing. It was a warning out. In the colonial period, there was this charming practice of warning out. Here's the backstory. If you were born in a given town, you were deemed to be a citizen of that town. If you were born in another town and moved here, you couldn't be a citizen with voting rights and voting rights unless the town accepted you as a citizen. That practice ended, I think, sometimes in the 1820s or 30s. I'm looking at my friends in the back row. They may know. So you had to be accepted by a town if you weren't born in the town. And a big part of that was because the town was on the hook for financial assistance for anyone who fell into hard times. And warning someone out was a way to say, okay, that's a problem we don't want to have. People of color were warned out. People of European descent were warned out. It was equal opportunity practice. There was one episode in the 1770s where an enslaved man, his enslaver was a widow. Your place. Talking to about homeowners. An enslaved man who married a free woman of color, and the free woman of color was from another town, so she moved into Wenham, and they had kids here in town. And at one point, it appears that they tried to find a place to live that wasn't the enslaver's farm. And somebody had their nose bent out of shape and brought it to the attention of the court. And it was going to turn into a case of warding out where the court was about to say, all right, no, you guys have got to get out of town. At the last minute, the case was dropped. So they weren't warned out of town. That's the only case I've been able to find that relates to Wenham. But by the way, that story provokes an intriguing question that's unanswered. If this enslaved man and his wife, free woman of color, were looking for a place to live that was not the enslaver's farm, who was renting space to an enslaved man in Wenham in the 1770s? One more question. Yes?
Well, first, I just wanted to, I think on behalf of everyone, just thank you for this. This is both sobering and an incredible gift for the town to deal with our history, and so thank you. wondering if your curiosity, caused you to try and find descendants of any of, through ancestry records?
As I look at my friends in the background, yes, I'd love to. Hasn't happened yet, but one of my friends back there knows somebody who thinks they are descended from an enslaved person who lived in Wenham. So we're trying to make that connection. Okay, thank you all for coming.